Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're tackling something that, let's just be brutally honest here, usually gets a bad rap in the ministry and care world. Yep, documentation. It's so easy to view charting as just this bureaucratic hurdle, right? Like some necessary evil waiting for you at the end of a long, exhausting day of counseling. But the source documents from Restoring Hope Ministries completely flip that script. They reframe documentation not as a chore, but as a sacred stewardship. It's literally an act of care that protects vulnerable people, preserves a Christ-centered witness, and ensures we're legally and ethically staying right inside our scope of practice. So today we're going to unpack exactly how RHM translates this incredibly high calling into practical, everyday workflows, specifically looking at how we use Theranest, proper intake care, biblical assessment, and really all facets of recording. Let's get into it.
So here is our logical roadmap for this explainer. We're covering the stewardship of documentation, proper intake and triage, biblical assessment and scope, writing faithful SOAP notes, and finally, Theranest and security workflows. We're going from core ethical convictions all the way down to the nitty-gritty software steps.
First up, the stewardship of documentation, laying the ethical foundation. Before anyone even thinks about touching an intake form or logging into a software system, we absolutely have to establish the heart behind why we document in the first place.
The core RHM conviction is captured beautifully in this idea. A biblical counseling SOAP note should be true, restrained, useful, supervised when needed, and anchored in Scripture. Why all those specific words? Well, because our notes literally have to do three massive things. They have to protect the counselee from clinical overreach, protect you, the counselor, by documenting exactly what was done, and protect the integrity of the ministry itself. Remember, a care note is not a sermon, it's not your personal diary, and it is definitely not the place to prove how incredibly insightful you are. It is, at its core, a faithful ministry record.
Because this responsibility is just so heavy, RHM doesn't just hand out login credentials to anyone who signs up to volunteer. There are rigorous prerequisites in place. Everyone, no matter their exact role, has to complete the Biblical Ethics for Christ-Centered Care course. And for folks specifically in counselor roles, you've also got to finish advanced biblical counseling interventions. And you have to actually upload those certificates to the HR portal before you even start. It's a non-negotiable. This just ensures that everyone fully gets role clarity, confidentiality, and documentation expectations way before they ever sit down with a client.
All right, moving on to proper intake and triage, the front door of biblical care. This is where we look at how we actually handle intake, and specifically how measurement tools like Blueprint are adapted for ministry use without us accidentally stepping outside our bounds.
There is such a careful balance to strike here. When we use intake triage, we use the data to clarify a person's distress and figure out referral needs or urgency. That's the purpose. But the hard boundary, we never ever promise clinical treatment outcomes from a screener. For ongoing care, we use it to track change and inform our care planning, but we absolutely do not reduce a suffering person to mere data points or scores. We have to integrate their actual story. And crucially, if a screener signals a risk, we identify the need for immediate consultation. We never manage imminent safety concerns alone. You escalate, period.
Which naturally brings up a pretty critical question, one that every single ministry worker really has to grapple with at some point. Can I use clinical words in biblical or pastoral notes? I mean, think about it for a second. If you're reading a screener that clearly mentions anxiety or depression, should you jot down that you are treating their anxiety? That brings us to biblical assessment and scope, staying scope safe in Wisconsin. And the answer to that previous question? It is a resounding absolute no. The crucial point here is that we must maintain strict, unwavering boundaries between clinical psychotherapy and biblical care. Doing this prevents legal and ethical role confusion, and quite frankly, it protects you under Wisconsin state law.
So, to stay completely scope safe, what we do instead is perform a biblical assessment. This is defined as a disciplined pastoral or biblical synthesis of what appears to be happening in the care process. We're identifying patterns, tracking progress, noting obstacles, and pulling out spiritual themes. But, and this is the absolute bottom line you have to remember, we do all of this without ever making a clinical diagnosis. Assessing a spiritual or relational theme, say deep grief or a pattern of relational avoidance, does not mean we are diagnosing a medical or psychological condition. Those are two very different things.
There is a stark, black and white contrast here between clinical overreach and correct, scope-safe RHM language. You are a biblical or pastoral counselor, not a therapist offering psychotherapy. The person across from you is a counselee, not a patient.
And instead of saying the patient presents with or writing clinician diagnosed, you use phrases like counseling reported, observed pattern, or presenting concern. You're offering a biblical care plan, not a treatment plan. The vocabulary you choose fundamentally defines the legal and ethical reality of your care. Words matter. In fact, to make those boundaries just crystal clear, RHM highly recommends using this exact safety anchor phrase right in your notes. No diagnostic statement is made in this biblical care note. It's just a simple, brilliant little sentence to clarify your scope on the permanent record. Use it.
Let's jump into writing faithful SOAP notes, translating standard format into pastoral care. We're going to see how all this scope-safe language actually builds into the physical writing of our notes. We're taking that standard medical SOAP skeleton, but completely translating the vocabulary into pastoral care.
So, here is the classic SOAP structure, but heavily adapted for RHM's biblical boundaries. The skeleton stays recognizable to any supervisor, but the content is totally different. S is subjective. You record the counselee's voice, their fears, their spiritual themes, but again, you avoid diagnosing. O is objective. This is what you actually did, the counselor's actions, and you want to use scripture parentheticals here. A is assessment, a synthesis of patterns and supervision needs, but, say it with me, no clinical diagnosis. Finally, P is for plan, the next practical steps. This could be scripture reading, homework, or setting referral thresholds.
Let's zoom in on that objective section with a super specific scenario. Say your pastoral intervention was really just being a slow, comforting presence. How do you actually document that? Well, you don't just write, "I listened." Instead, you write something like, "Biblical counselor used attentive listening, careful reflection, and restraint in speech to honor the counselee's story." And then you add those scripture parentheticals at the end, like James 1:19 or Proverbs 18:13. These act as anchors. They document the biblical logic behind your actions. You aren't just haphazardly dropping in proof texts. You're proving that your intervention was deeply rooted in biblical wisdom. Which brings us to our final section, Theranest and security workflows, the final step of stewardship. Because honestly, all this beautiful, careful, scope-safe documentation we've been talking about, it's completely useless if it isn't secured properly. At RHM, Theranest is our official system of record. Not your personal laptop, not some random cloud drive you set up. Theranest.
When you're drafting notes or handling intake files, you have got to adhere to the double lock standard. This means we protect client info with two completely independent layers before it even touches a temporary Microsoft staging area. Lock 1 is your account and access control. Think multi-factor authentication. Lock 2 is content and device control, like restricted encrypted folders. And please remember, Microsoft 365 is never the long-term chart. It is strictly 100% just a temporary staging area.
Just to be absolutely crystal clear, here is a rapid-fire list of things that must not happen in Microsoft 365. You cannot drop client narratives or trauma disclosures into Teams chats just because it's convenient. You cannot use unmanaged USB drives or leave things in your personal downloads folder. No personal OneDrive, no personal email, no text messages, and please, absolutely no feeding sensitive client info into public AI tools. ChatGPT does not need to know your counselee's deepest struggles. Sensitive disclosures must never, ever be scattered across casual communication platforms.
So, practically, how do you get data from an intake tool like Blueprint securely over into Theranest? You follow this exact 5-phase workflow. 1. Generate and review only the needed reports. 2. Export or download it only to an approved managed device. 3. Upload it directly into the correct client account in Theranest. 4. Summarize that screening in a SOAP note. And 5, and this is so critical, delete and purge that temporary export file locally. As the RHM policy wisely points out, the absolute safest duplicate file is the one that no longer exists after it's safely tucked away inside Theranest. And finally, keep in mind that our boundaries totally extend to how we message our counselees. Always use the Theranest portal for client-specific messages. You cannot conduct substantive biblical counseling over an unsecured text thread on your iPhone. It's just not safe. And if an imminent crisis arises, a portal message is not enough. You have to follow the RHM emergency escalation protocol immediately. We've covered a ton of ground today in this explainer, from the deep heart of ethical care to the specific security clicks inside Theranest. But I want to leave you with this final provocative question. Is your documentation a rushed, bureaucratic chore, or is it a sacred, scope-safe stewardship that truly honors the vulnerability of those entrusted to your care? Every single SOAP note you write, Every file you securely upload and every boundary you maintain is a vital, living act of Christ-centered ministry. Treat it with the absolute reverence it deserves. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep up the incredible work.